Thank you very much for the introduction, for the invitation, and also, especially also for this invitation to participate in the Architekturtheorie-Tage, which I see as an opportunity to get to know many of you who are active in the German-speaking world. As you notice, I'm not speaking German myself, for which I apologize, but that will change. I'm also very happy to be asked to talk about XENOTHEKA, which, as Vega already mentioned, is a digital learning environment that we are developing currently at my chair at the ETH in close collaboration with the chair of computer-aided design of Ludwig Hovestad. This is the very first time that I try to explain what we are doing with this digital learning environment outside of our own, you could say, context. And so I look very forward to your feedback and comments. Especially, and perhaps I start with a very bold claim, that Ludwig Hovestad and myself believe that we are working on something that actually might challenge deeply ingrained notions about how we think and teach architectural history and theory. So the title of my talk should be taken literally. So in XENOTHEKA, we explore architectural history and theory not through the framework of history, so not by means of a narrative that takes temporal and to some extent spatial relationships as its underlying frame of reference, or as its primary mode of explanation. So in XENOTHEKA, we very explicitly distance ourselves from the kind of reasoning that is structured as this happened because it was then and there, before this and after that. Nor do we so we also distance ourselves from any structural approach to history and theory. But we want to approach history and theory of architecture through the manipulation of texts, divorced from any form of context. So literally the manipulation of texts on the level of the sign. There are three basic assumptions that underpin the project. I mean, there are other assumptions, but I want to start with these three. That basically making this gesture, so proposing a way of dealing with history and theory that basically dissociates itself from historical thinking, that this gesture puts other forms of doing and performing architectural history and theory into sharper relief, so that it actually might help to foster an awareness amongst students, but also amongst the people who use the platform of the constructedness of any architectural historical approach, and then be a kind of invitation actually to a dialogue to weigh and to balance the respective merits of different kinds of approaches to architectural history. The second assumption is that I believe that we need to educate our students in forms of digital literacy that do not rely on translating analog models, so that do not rely on translating models for analyzing, weighing, judging, criticizing information that are actually rooted in analog culture, but that we should try to work with the possibilities and challenges of the digital itself. And that thirdly, you could say a more pragmatic assumption is that if we do that, if we work that way, we might find ways to appeal to what are commonly called digital natives, as it puts themselves in the role of producers of knowledge rather than receivers. So what I'll do now in the next 25 minutes or so is actually a description of why we've been doing this, what we are doing, and what we more or less have now. So I will not theorize it. I will just try to put it here in front of you and see. And I would be really curious to see what you think. Also, harsh criticism is very welcome. I mean, yeah, it is, but if it's offered with generosity, let's put it that way. So, still, I hope that it will emerge how these assumptions, the three assumptions I just mentioned, inform the project. And obviously, I'll be happy to elaborate in discussion. So first, I will give some context and the considerations, but also very basically the opportunities that gave way to the project. Then a brief description of what we have now. So we started working with it 6 weeks ago, so at the start of the academic year. And then finally, prospects and challenges. So I start very anecdotally. The first idea for this environment came at Thursday evening at 1 a.m. when I was downloading an image from an open source digital repository. It was a drawing by Boulet, which is Etienne Louis Boulet, which is digitized in Gallica at a very high resolution. I was downloading it and pasting it into a PowerPoint of the lecture that I was preparing for the next day. So this is something most of us do the night before a lecture, I think. But I was obviously struck by the absurdity of the situation. So I was copying open source digital material from an incredibly rich repertory into a digital display for passive consumption by 300 students. So just to give you the context, the course I'm talking about is the first year architectural history survey in the architecture department at the ETH, which addresses more or less 300 students. Less so when the crits arrive, and then it covers chronologically the Renaissance up to the 19th century over more or less 20 lectures, so it's pretty dense. So the obvious question, and when you realize the absurdity of the situation, is why didn't I send the students directly to the repository? Say, okay, that's the URL, go look for yourself. So why didn't I activate the students instead of making them passive consumers? There are, of course, very good reasons why I don't, or why we don't do that. I think a positive reason not to do it is the importance of narrative or of a voice in teaching. Teaching is as much about what you say, is as much about how you say things as what you say, as we all know. So things happen when you speak. I think this is basically also what Pico was talking about, that do not happen in other moments. So that's a positive argument, not just to send students to Gallica. Obviously, there are also the negative reasons why we do not do it. I think we are familiar with the fact that if we ask students to collect material on the internet about Boulet or his design for the Bibliothèque Royale, chances are that many students will not get much further than compiling information from the first 10 hits on Google, with very little sense for history or criticality. From our academic point of view. So the quality of the students' work is a direct function of the quality of what they come across, and the chance that they will find the high-resolution scans of the original drawings of Boulet and some relevant commentary on that purely depends on whether these drawings are referenced in Wikipedia or whether Google picks up their metadata or not. I want to make clear that my position here is not that I'm accusing students today from laziness or other things, quite to the contrary. But I do want to point out, obviously, that this happens because the way search engines are geared and how information is presented and stored and made available through the internet. And secondly, because students do lack the traditional tools for historical and critical inquiry, especially if they're in their first weeks at the university. So the fundamental paradox, I think, there is that never before primary sources, but also secondary sources and very good critical material have been so easily accessible over the internet. I mean, it's literally true that, I mean, this is also something we all know. Now I do my research behind my desktop. I used to travel to Rome and libraries and so to be able to look at books. So the increase in material that is available is exponential, but we lack ways of directing our students to these sources and to explore them. Actually, mostly because there's too much. There's a problem of a manyness, of a plenty that we cannot successfully address, and it's actually because of the plenty that students don't get where we want them, and if they get there, they are not necessarily equipped to deal with what they found. And obviously, I think, to state the obvious, this is a pity. I mean, we are now actually in a situation, I think for the first time ever, that we can actually teach history straight from primary sources. So without any mediation of secondary literature, so you can basically show what there is. When you talk about hypnagotomachia polyphily, you can browse through the hypnagotomachia polyphily, and this is possible now. It wasn't possible 10 years ago. So, so there is some. These primary sources have an aura. It makes students incredibly happy to deal with primary sources, and obviously you can again give voice to things that by looking at these sources that you can't articulate otherwise. So how to tackle this paradox, or tackle these problems? So the first problem that I identified, so the fact that there is too much and that in the plenty we actually not even lose our way, but are almost impeded from getting where we might want to get. One way of tackling that problem is to create an environment where it would be safe to navigate. So basically a curated environment consisting of primary sources drawn from open sources repositories that could support teaching. Making such a repository, I mean, many people, I mean, this is obviously not a new idea, but I think it's not commonly thought of in terms of teaching, using it as a teaching device for very young students. Building such a repository, I thought, would have the added advantage to allow me to be more selective in what I actually talk about. So, obviously, when you teach a survey course, you feel obliged that people know more than one building of Michelangelo and more than one building of Bramante, or more than one chapter of the Architektura, or that they, next to Alberti and Vitruvius, they actually have heard of Cattaneo as well, and so on. So when you have basically this repository in your back, you know that other projects, texts, and so on are available for exploration and self-study. The second thing that such a repository might address is the whole problem, I think, that we have with inclusiveness in teaching architectural history and theory. I definitely believe that we should teach and do research on things that we know something of, which in my case is the European tradition from the 15th century up to now. But still, if this is the way you open up architectural history to new students, you do start from a very Italocentric and also very male-gendered perspective. So perhaps I was thinking that if we have an environment, we can sort of mitigate the centrality of some of these perspectives. Now, then there's the second, there was obviously the second problem, the question that students, obviously when they enter the university, but very often also later, lack the traditional tools for historical and critical inquiry. There, my position is based as much on experience as a teacher, to some extent even as a parent than on academic research. But still, I do think that some of the mental habits that, let's say, people of my generation more or less still take for granted, and that we actually have naturalized in our way of thinking about things, are less evident for digital natives, because they are very much used to different ways of finding, selecting, and evaluating information. So I know that my habit for looking at things, simply scanning this room, is a historical philological one. So you basically build chronologies, you build genealogies, you go back to origins as a way of structuring your world, and that's not only true when I do research or when I teach, but that's also true when I walk in the streets. So there's this kind of naturalized habit of framing the world in terms of in historical terms and in terms of genealogy. So basically, again, oriented around questions: where do things come from? Where do they have their origins, and how do these origins relate to each other in the environment? You will obviously have noted that this talk too is structured as a genealogy. As an architectural historian, of course, this habit, this naturalized habit, enhances, but I do think it's very much shaped by an education that basically has its roots in humanism, and that to some extent is therefore a shared habit also for people who are not professional historians. Now, in my experience, and not only in my experience, I think it has become increasingly difficult to instill this habit that for us is naturalized in students, and to teach them the tools to articulate it. So the question of referencing, evaluating sources, the difference between primary and secondary sources, the difference between a citation, a copy, and plagiarism, and so on. I've noticed that it's that we increasingly lack the common ground to explain these contexts, these concepts, because these are categories and differences that digital natives, to use this term, do not experience or know from their own digital engagement with information and knowledge. So this is a bold statement, but let's go with that. This is, again, not an indictment, quite to the contrary, because I think it's opens up a lot of possibilities, and this is exactly what XENOTHEKA is about, but the observation of a gap. So as a consequence, I've become convinced that it is more productive to teach history and theory starting from the premises and capacities of students, that is, without history, than enforcing the essentially analog historical philological approach until they get it. So it's basically about, you could say, accepting horizontality rather than verticality in the way you structure, or you sort of try to collect and structure information and data. So, also, I mean, to basically try to think how kind of criticality towards material, a kind of critical interpretation of material is possible if you don't use this naturalized habit of chronology, history, and genealogy, but if you say, actually, if you accept the flatness of the information, the data, the images, and so on that surround us. Voila. So, more or less, while I was having these thoughts, I mean, obviously, I've been thinking about this for a while. I had a conversation with Ludger Hovestad of the CAD chair, and he organized a presentation by Miro Roman, a PhD student of Ludwig and Vega. So what became clear is two things on a very basic level. So Ludwig and I discovered that we were teaching in parallel in the first year, and that Ludwig was basically reorganizing his mathematics course in order to give a lot of room to coding, to teaching students how to program in order to increase their digital literacy. So the aim of the mathematics course in part is basically to emancipate students from, you could say, the purely technological aspect of many of the programs and the tools they use, and basically to allow to understand them and critically engage with these very tools. Secondly, the work of Miro Roman is one way of explaining it is something you can understand as a strategy to engage with multitudes, and this is speaks to the problem I was talking about with manyness and with manyness of texts. So what Miro proposes in his PhD, which he's currently finishing, is that instead of reading texts and interpreting them as a way to forge a relationship with these texts, he basically proposes to treat them as characters in a drama, or characters that populate a space, characters who have relationships among themselves and with whom you, as a subject, can enter into relationships. Again, these relationships are not defined by what these texts mean or symbolize, or how they fit in a symbolical order, such as a historical order, but they are defined by the characteristics of these texts and by the nature of their character. And this nature of the character is constructed and explored by manipulating the text on the level of the sign. A very basic example of what I'm talking about is actually to make a word cloud of a book. That's working on a text on the level of a sign. So what Miro has done for his PhD is basically establish a library of a couple of hundred texts, and he basically tries to different manipulations, different ways of selecting, different operations, develop or grasp the affinities between texts. Again, not by reading them and coming to a kind of critical understanding, but just by looking at the words that constitute the text, frequencies, vicinities between words, relationships that occur between different texts if you sort of fuse them, or if you sort of privilege certain words over others, and so on. And this is basically the technology that we are using for XENOTHEKA. What I found striking about it is that that it allows that this way of working with texts on level of the sign allows you to deal with many books at the same time in a very nimble way. That's the second thing, and in a way that can be represented in a very graphically compelling way. So after these exchanges, Ludwig and I decided to start a common project, which was the XENOTHEKA project, which is the XENOTHEKA project. I hired an assistant, Annika Abelak, who isn't an academic but a curator. I thought it was really important to have a curator on the team who would basically curate the collection of XENOTHEKA. So we need to get this started. Yep. So what I'll do now is try to show you what we have come up with. So, as I already suggested, I think, so XENOTHEKA depends on the curated library. Yeah? So we do not work on the internet, but in principle, the environment could include any open source material that is in the right format. I'll come to the format in a moment. So the right format is basically clean text. Archive.org provides text in this format. Now, as a starting point, Anneke basically proposed to use my own library because she said that basically my own library reflects best of it. Ah, which one? Ah, yeah, okay. No. Yeah, it's all connected. Is it okay? No problem. Oh, the digital. So my library was scanned by a team of student assistants with the help of a very professional and actually quite cool book scanner. And so what we have now is this. One of the challenges is copyright. I will return to that in a moment. But just to assure you, this is password protected. So only if you have an ETH password, you can get in here. And so for each book, so I agree, we have the PDF, HTML, because HTML privileges certain manipulations. And then basically this is the key documented text, so this is the clean out text. So also one of the things that we actually teach the students is to make such a text, which we believe is actually an important transferable skill, so that they basically can transform any book into a text that is prone to the manipulations here that we allow it to do. Then, so this is the full list of books. So now we are at close to 300 books. So we limited ourselves to books in English for the beginning, which, for instance, for my library is obviously a big limitation because more than half of it is in Italian. Now, the kind of coding that we unleash on these texts is again developed by Ludwig and Migo. And what I give you here is another is a project by Migo Roman, Texting Architects, send a text to 100 prominent architects, which basically works on the same principle. So if I say I want to know what 100 architects think about proportion, then I get these answers. Yeah? So again, the search is obviously not semantic. Huh? It has nothing to do with data, with metadata. It's purely retrieving the word proportion in a string of words, of which the programming language, which is or the commands which work on the platform of Mathematica, for instance, allow you to set the length of string, the string of words that you want to have. So why would we want to do this kind of thing? I mean, because again, it is very basic. You throw one word in many texts, which, I mean, as a side note, isn't as self-evident as it is to get this as quickly. But the basic ambition for us is to have students engage with 300 books at the same time, which they would never, if you say to students or to any one of us, read these 300 books so that you can tell something about it, that won't work. Yeah? Within this environment, we can basically say to people, okay, just test for words that interest you or word combinations that interest you, where they occur. Yeah? Find the text, and then obviously in the next step, we hope that there's some kind of, you could say, affinity between the student and the text. The way this looks in the XENOTHEKA environment is like this. So this is an exercise we did 2 weeks ago, exactly 2 weeks ago, where we asked the students to write a poem on beauty. So we selected 23 books from the XENOTHEKA library that I just showed you. So you see the list of books on the upper left. And then you can ask a question to the library, just like we asked the question to the architects. But this is slightly more sophisticated in the sense that here, again, you can manipulate the string length, but you can also combine words. So, for instance, this is then, so these are dead pages, these are screenshots. So I'm not live in the environment. So if you say the phrase is beauty and city, you get one paragraph from Albection painting, Augustine, City of God, and so on. If it is harmony and beauty, again, you get a different set of samples. Now, also from the art of rhetoric, if you say, okay, it's proportion and beauty, the art of rhetoric emerges, and so on. This is the very first, very basic step of the most basic kind of manipulations that the environment provides. And obviously, the work that we are going to do throughout the year is to make these to increase the number of commands, to increase the number of commands that are available to the students, and obviously to increase the complexity of the manipulations that can be done in the library. For instance, now, as I said, we decided to work on only 23 books. In the end, at the end of the year, so the amount of books they work on will also increase over the course of the year, so that at the end of the year they will be working with the full library. Okay. So the next step, so what we then asked the students is to make a poem. So this is the word cloud of the poem, and the poems, so there were 70 students working on this. The 70 poems then went back into our environment. And I'll just show you the PDF of the poems. So this is the introduction by Migo and Anneke. And this is, for instance, one of the poems that one of the first year students came up with. What beauty is, I know not, though it adheres to many things. Beauty is so much hidden, so blind is our knowledge. And then it refers to Edwin Holt, Literary Sources of Art History. The issue in question in a simpler formulation and so on is a sentence from Architecture and the Culture of Early Humanism. So what you basically have is students working on an enormous amount of basically topoi, which contain the word beauty in different combinations, which they are then invited to combine into a poem that makes sense according to them. Secondly, they need to reference their sources. It becomes immediately clear that there are all kinds of, I think, very interesting problems that emerge with this procedure. For instance, if you scroll further, sometimes students will use sentences that are actually very banal sentences connecting, for instance, one paragraph to another as something, as a meaningful statement on beauty. Secondly, there's, for instance, the book that is referenced here, Edwin Holt, Literary Sources of Art History, is obviously a book that compiles primary sources with commentary. The difference between commentary and primary sources is completely erased. But this is actually the whole point of the exercise, according to us. So by allowing students literally to work, you could say, on the grain of the text, you could say that the responsibility for sense making is shifted entirely to the student. So suddenly we have students who need to try to make sense of fragments that they've retrieved of an enormous corpus of source materials in such a way that they can build a discourse. In our view, this is the exact opposite what happens than when you do, for instance, a Google search, where you basically have a pre-formatted algorithm that reacts on metadata according to a set of criteria that are determined partly commercially, partly in terms of efficiency. So basically, Google, to some extent, plays the role of sense maker. And then again, I want to turn back to the problem that I raised in the beginning. Then we are there, academics saying, but that doesn't make sense. But it's incredibly hard to explain, and I consider myself a good teacher, why what Google yields does not make sense. Obviously, you can say, and I'm sure some of you are saying, this doesn't make sense either. This is a kind of gratuitous a montage of statements that have a vague relationship with each other. But you can speak to the person who has made these decisions, and you can you have a place, a moment, an artifact that allows you to discuss the process that has been going on. So in that sense, we do think that we contribute, and I'm going way over my time, I apologize, to digital literacy, but also to new ways of to experimenting with new forms of discourse, new forms of storytelling, and new forms, again, of making sense in an architectural, historical, theoretical context. So, to conclude, because again, I didn't watch the time, I just want to emphasize that obviously this isn't the only thing we teach our students in the first year course. So we have a traditional lecture course, and again, what I think this helps me to do is to focus on things in my lectures where I think I have something to say, and where I don't, where I think I have something to say. At the same time, we take students to physical libraries. So the whole first year visits, for instance, the Werner Oechslin Stiftung, where we basically show them a library in you could say the most in its almost most essential humanist form. And at the same time, obviously, they have their course in mathematics, where the same tools are used and explored in different contexts. And I also want to emphasize that I'm quite happy that I think this is quite unique that we have a joint teaching project between an architecture history course and a mathematics course at the university, so that there's actually a point of intersection. The last thing that I want to say, and then I'll really stop, is that it is also our ambition, obviously, that we introduce the XENOTHEKA over the course of the first year in mathematics and in architectural history, but that it basically becomes part of the luggage or the environment of the students for their career at the ETH, so that when they're in the studio of Christian Gantenbein and they start talking about proportion, that they can again delve into XENOTHEKA and find topoi, places, IDs, but also especially characters and friends amongst the books that we provide there for them. Thank you.